It is so much a pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 Theos Annual Lecture. If we've not met, I'm Elizabeth Oldfield and I'm the director of Theos, and it is just delightful to get to spend this time with you tonight, even at a distance. I really hope that even though we are on a digital platform for the first time for our annual lecture, you can still have a sense of having a shared encounter, a shared experience tonight, something as human and as relational as we can possibly make it. For those of you who are new to Theos, who are here mainly because you are one of Michael's millions of fans, we are a religion and society think tank with a Christian basis. We exist really to enrich and inform the conversation about the role of religion, of identity, of our deepest values in society. We believe that Christianity in particular, and religion in general, has a huge amount to offer for the common good. That rather than being a threat, these traditions are a gift, that there are treasures in these ideas and these communities that can contribute to the flourishing, even of those who have no religious belief themselves. We do a range of social research, trying to address some of the misunderstandings and myths about religion. We provide media commentary, we make podcasts, and we host events like this one tonight. The Theos Annual Lecture is, I believe, going into its 12th year. I need to check that with one of my team who were here at the beginning. Previous lecturers include Jonathan Sachs, Marilyn Robinson, Rowan Williams, the former Director General of the BBC, Mark Thompson, and last year's startlingly beautiful lecture by actor Sally Phillips on disability, which I wholeheartedly recommend you go and check out on YouTube. And for the last 6 years, we have very much enjoyed partnering with CCLA on these events. And we're really grateful that they have once again agreed to support this evening's event. One of their directors said recently that his definition of a sustainable partnership was one where the ongoing support is justified by the outcomes. And given that we're in our 6th year, we must be getting something right. Certainly from our point of view, it's been wonderful because we share so many values. If you don't know them, CCLA is the UK's leading fund manager who invests money for charities, churches, faith-based organisations and local authorities. They provide the secretariat for the Church Investors Group, handling really, really big sums of money in responsible ways with an eye on the common good. And they have been a pioneer of socially responsible investing, of ESG investing. From everything that we've seen of them, they really are trying to put money into the service of the common good, and we are grateful for their partnership. In just a moment, I have the pleasure of introducing this year's annual lecturer, Michael Sandel. But first, I want to make sure everyone knows what's going to happen. We have, of course, spent quite a lot of time, all of us, more than we hoped to, on Zoom this year, but things might be a little different tonight, so I just want to explain it. We have opted for a format where we can see your faces. It is partly about, not to sound too pious, deep theological convictions about relationship and hospitality and the ethical call of the human face. But it's also because we want to try and take live questions to be able to have a proper conversation. Those of you who've had the privilege of seeing Michael speak or teach before know that that interaction is a real hallmark. So we're going to try and make that happen in a digital format. That means that Michael is going to deliver a shorter lecture than some other years. There's going to be a conversation then with him and Nick Spencer, who is our senior fellow. They'll have 20-25 minutes to talk. And we hope that that will whet your appetite for a longer conversation they've already had. Coming soon, Reading Our Times is a new podcast project from Theos, presented by Nick Spencer. And the first episode with Michael Sandel will be out in the next week or so. So please keep your ears and your eyes peeled for that. After their conversation, I will be able to take some questions from you lovely audience. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to our 2020 Theos Annual Lecturer. And I'm not going to recite his incredibly eminent biography or list his blockbuster books, all of which are on the Theos bookshelf, much dog-eared and underlined. I will just remind you that the book which is the subject of tonight's lecture, The Tyranny of Merit, What Has Become of the Common Good, is available from our partner bookshop at a special discount. And one of my colleagues will share the link in the chat box so you can even be book shopping while you listen in. I think that's all from me. With the help of my wonderful colleagues, I'm now going to hand over to Michael Sandel for tonight's lecture.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's a great honor to be invited to deliver the Theos annual lecture. And I'm grateful to you for having invited me to speak about some of the themes of my new book, The Tyranny of Merit: What's Become of the Common Good. Our civic life isn't going very well. What passes for public discourse consists too often of shouting matches where we don't really listen to one another, much less engage with the arguments and the moral convictions that citizens bring to public life. We live in polarized times. And one of the aims of my book, what inspired me to write it, what provoked me to write it, was to try to give an account of what brought us to this polarized, rancorous political moment. For decades, the divide between winners and losers has been driving us apart, poisoning our politics. Now, this divide is partly about inequality, which has deepened over the last 4 decades. But it's also about something else. It's about the attitudes toward winning and losing that came with the deepening inequality. Those who landed on top came to believe that their success was their own doing, a measure of their merit, and that those left behind had no one to blame but themselves. This way of thinking about success arises from a seemingly attractive principle. If everyone starts out with an equal chance, then those who succeed deserve the rewards their talents bring. This is the heart of the meritocratic ideal. Now, in practice, of course, we fall short. Not everyone in our societies does have an equal chance to rise. Children born to poor parents tend to stay poor when they grow up, and affluent parents have figured out how to pass their advantages on to their kids. But the problem isn't only that we fail to live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. The ideal itself, even if we could achieve it, the ideal itself has a dark side. Meritocracy is corrosive of the common good. It leads to hubris among the winners and humiliation for those who lose out. It encourages the successful to inhale too deeply of their success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way. And it leads the successful to look down on those less fortunate than themselves. One of the most potent sources of the populist backlash we're seeing, backlash against elites, is the sense among many working people that elites look down on them. This is a legitimate complaint. Now, how did these attitudes toward success, giving rise to the resentment among many working people, how did they come about? The short answer is, or so it seems to me, they came about along with the market faith that accompanied the embrace by mainstream parties of globalization in the last 4 decades. But there is also a deeper history to the allure and to the harshness of meritocracy. It goes back a very long way, and in fact, has theological origins. And so tonight, I would like to try to give an account of the deep moral and theological story of merit, the allure of merit, but also its morally corrosive aspects. But first, let me say a word about the appeal, the allure of meritocracy. At the heart of the appeal is a certain conception of freedom. The idea that our destiny is in our own hands, that our success doesn't depend on the accident of our birth or on forces beyond our control, that it's up to us. We are not victims of circumstance, but masters of our fate, free to rise as far as our efforts and talents will take us. This is an exhilarating vision of human agency, and it goes hand in hand with a morally comforting conclusion. We get what we deserve. If my success is truly my own doing, something I've earned through talent and hard work, I can take pride in it, confident that I deserve the rewards my achievements bring. And so a meritocratic society is doubly inspiring. It affirms a powerful notion of freedom, and it gives people what they have earned for themselves and therefore deserve. That's the appeal. That's the allure. But the principle of merit can take a tyrannical turn. Not only when societies fail to live up to it, but also, indeed especially, when they do. The dark side of the meritocratic ideal is embedded in its most alluring promise, the promise of mastery, of self-making. This promise comes with a burden that is difficult to bear. The meritocratic ideal places great weight on the idea of personal responsibility. Now, holding people responsible for what they do is a good thing, up to a point. It respects their capacity to think and act for themselves as moral agents and as citizens. But it is one thing to hold people responsible for acting morally, and something else to assume that we are, each of us, wholly responsible for our lot in life. In fact, even the phrase, our lot in life, draws on a moral vocabulary that suggests certain limits to unbridled responsibility. To speak of one's lot suggests the drawing of lots, which, after all, is a result determined by fate or fortune or divine providence, not by our own effort. It points beyond merit and choice to the realm of luck and chance, or on some accounts, grace. This reminds us that the most consequential early debates about merit were not about income and jobs, but about God's favor. Is it something we earn or receive as a gift? This is how the career of merit was launched. The notion that our fate reflects our merit runs deep in the moral intuitions of Western culture. Biblical theology teaches that natural events happen for a reason. Favorable weather, a bountiful harvest, these are divine rewards for good behavior. Drought and pestilence are punishments for sin. When a ship encounters stormy seas, people ask, who on the crew has angered God? Now, from the distance of our scientific age, this way of thinking seems quaint, innocent, even childlike. But it is not as distant as it first appears. In fact, this outlook is the origin of meritocratic thinking. It reflects the belief that the moral universe is arranged in a way that aligns prosperity with merit and suffering with wrongdoing. This isn't so far from the familiar contemporary view that wealth signifies talent and hard work, and that poverty signifies indolence. Two features of the biblical outlook offer an intimation of contemporary meritocracy. One is its emphasis on human agency, and the other is its harshness toward those who suffer misfortune. Think back to the story of Job. Job was a just and righteous man. He was subjected to unspeakable pain and suffering, including the death of his sons and daughters in a storm. And he can't fathom why such suffering has been visited upon him. And as he mourns the loss of his family, his fellow mourners, his friends, so to speak, are asking him, what egregious sin did you commit? It must be something. They press Job to try to imagine what this sin could have been. This is an early example of the tyranny of merit. Armed with the assumption that suffering signifies sin, Job's friends compound his pain by claiming that in virtue of some transgression or other, Job must be to blame for the death of his sons and daughters. And Job himself is wondering how this could be. When God finally speaks to Job, he rejects this cruel logic of blaming the victim, and he does so, it's interesting to notice, he does so by renouncing the meritocratic assumption that Job and his companions share. Not everything that happens, God explains from the whirlwind. Not everything that happens is a reward or a punishment for human behavior. All rain is not for the sake of watering the crops of the righteous, nor is every drought for the sake of punishing the wicked. Creation is not only for the sake of human beings. The cosmos is bigger and God's ways more mysterious than the anthropomorphic picture suggests. So in renouncing the idea that he presides over a cosmic meritocracy, God asserts his unbounded power, and he teaches Job a lesson in humility. Humility in the face of the mystery of God's ways. Faith in God means accepting the grandeur and mystery of creation, not expecting God to dispense rewards and punishment based on what each person deserves. The question of merit reappears in Christian debates about salvation. Here the question was this: can the faithful earn salvation through religious observance and good works, or is God entirely free to decide whom to save, regardless of how people live their lives? Now, each answer, each account, each of these two accounts raises certain theological difficulties. And one way of addressing those difficulties was to attribute free will to human beings, shifting the responsibility for evil from God to us. An early proponent of this solution was the 5th century British monk, Pelagius. And some say because he emphasized free will and individual responsibility, that he was in a way a forerunner of liberalism. Augustine would have none of it. He argued fiercely against Pelagius that attributing free will to human beings denies the omnipotence of God and undermines the significance of his ultimate gift, the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. But despite Augustine's insistence on salvation by grace alone, the practices of the church brought merit back in. Rites and rituals, baptism, prayer, attending Mass, performing the sacraments. These can't persist for long without prompting a sense of efficacy, agency among the participants. When faith is embodied in outward observance, mediated and reinforced by a complex array of church practices, a theology of gratitude and grace slides almost inevitably toward a theology of pride and self-help. This, at least, is how Martin Luther viewed the Roman Church of his time, 11 centuries after Augustine had inveighed against salvation by merit. And Luther revived this case against merit. In fact, one could say that the Protestant Reformation was born as an argument against merit. Martin Luther's case against the Catholic Church of his day was not only about the sale of indulgences. His broader point was that salvation is wholly a matter of God's grace and can't be influenced by any effort to win God's favor, whether through good works or the performance of rites. We can no more pray our way to heaven than buy our way in. For Luther, election is a gift that is entirely unearned. So we can see that Luther's stringent doctrine of grace was resolutely anti-meritocratic. It rejected salvation by good works, and yet paradoxically, the Protestant Reformation he launched led to the fiercely meritocratic work ethic the Puritans and their successors would bring to America. Now, how this happened is by now well known from the account, among others, of Max Weber in The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism. Like Luther, John Calvin, whose theology inspired the Puritans, held that salvation was a matter of God's grace, not determined by human merit or deservingness. But Calvin also had this doctrine of predestination, which in part was a way of accounting for God, the fact that our work can't determine our fate, whether or not we are saved. And Weber explains how work in a calling, work to glorify God, without consuming the fruits of that work, leads to an accumulation of wealth that provides the seeds and the ground of capitalism. But for our purposes, for this moral archaeology of the sources of merit, the real significance of this drama consists in the tension that develops between merit and grace for the Puritans. A lifetime of disciplined work in one's calling is not, to be sure, a route to salvation. It's a way of knowing whether one is already among the elect. It's a sign of salvation. Work and worldly success. These are signs of salvation, not the source of salvation. But it proved difficult, if not impossible, to resist the slide from viewing worldly activity as a sign of election to viewing it as a source. Psychologically, it is hard to bear the notion that God will take no notice of faithful works that increase his glory. Once I'm encouraged to infer from my good works that I am among the elect, it is hard to resist the thought that my good works have somehow contributed to my election. And this generated among the Puritans who were trying to think their way through and live out the implications of this dialectic of merit and grace. It led them, according to Max Weber, to look down with disdain on those apparently destined for damnation. Here, Max Weber glimpses what I would call an early version of meritocratic hubris. The consciousness of divine grace of the elect was accompanied by an attitude toward the sin of one's neighbor, this is Weber, not of sympathetic understanding, based on consciousness of one's own weakness, but of hatred and contempt for him as an enemy of God bearing the signs of eternal damnation. The spiritual aristocracy of the elect, in other words, looked down with contempt on those who struggled. And so the Protestant work ethic ends by promoting an ethic of self-help and responsibility for one's fate, congenial to meritocratic ways of thinking. This ethic unleashes a torrent of anxious, energetic striving that generates great wealth, but at the same time reveals the dark side of responsibility and self-making. The humility prompted by helplessness in the face of grace gives way to the hubris prompted by belief in one's own merit. Now, for Luther, Calvin, and the Puritans, debates about merit were about salvation. For us, debates about merit are about worldly success. Do the successful earn and therefore deserve their success, or is prosperity due to factors beyond our control? And at first glance, these two debates would seem to have little in common. One is religion, the other is religious, the other is secular. But if we look more closely, the meritocracy of our day bears the mark of the theological context from which it emerged. The Protestant work ethic began as a tense dialectic of merit and grace, of self-help and helplessness. And in the end, merit drove out grace. The ethic of mastery and self-making overwhelmed the ethic of gratitude and humility. Working and striving became imperatives of their own, detached from the Calvinist notions of predestination and the anxious search for a sign of salvation. It is tempting to attribute the triumph of mastery and merit to the secular bent of our time. As faith in God recedes, confidence in human agency gathers force. The more we conceive ourselves as self-made and self-sufficient, the less reason we have to feel indebted or grateful for our success. But even today, our attitudes towards success are not as independent of providential faith as we sometimes think. And we see this if we look at the conviction that those who succeed deserve their success. This triumphalist aspect of meritocracy generates hubris among the winners and humiliation among the losers. The fortunate person is seldom satisfied with the fact of being fortunate, Max Weber observed. He also needs to know that he has a right to his good fortune. He wants to be convinced that he deserves it, and above all, that he deserves it in comparison with others. He wishes to be allowed the belief that the less fortunate also merely experience their due. The tyranny of merit arises, at least in part, from this impulse. Today's secular meritocratic order moralizes success in ways that echo this earlier providential faith. Although the successful don't claim to owe their power and wealth to divine intervention, they see themselves as rising thanks to their own effort and hard work. They do see their success as reflecting their superior virtue. The rich are rich because they are more deserving than the poor. This triumphalist aspect of the meritocracy we live today is a kind of providentialism without God, or at least without a God who intervenes in human affairs. The successful make it on their own, but their success attests to their virtue. This is the common thread. This way of thinking heightens the moral stakes of economic competition. It sanctifies the winners and denigrates the losers. And when the so-called losers, when the less fortunate are denigrated or looked down upon, now 4 decades after the market faith has done its work, eventually they become resentful of those not only who have landed on top, but who believe they deserve to have landed on top. They believe that their success is their due. And when these resentments build, eventually, the working people, those left behind by globalization, who experience these resentments, who feel the galling sense of being looked down upon by those inhaling deeply of their success, eventually, they undertake a backlash against meritocratic elites, which brings us to the politics of our day. Thank you very much.
Michael, on behalf of the hundreds of people that are watching this, first of all, I'd like to give a virtual applause to you. An excellent lecture. You packed in an enormous amount of material into just half an hour or so. There's so much I could pick up on in our conversation here, and I do want to dedicate some time to where you began and ended the lecture, which is politics at the moment of resentment, and in particular in an election year, and so on and so forth. But I want to talk a little bit first of all about the moral archaeology you did. It was fascinating, the repeated dialectic you highlighted between merit and grace throughout. You see that in the discussion in Job. You see that between Augustine and Pelagius. You see that at the Protestant Reformation. To what extent do you think this is a distinctly Christian or Judeo-Christian feature? Or is it more profoundly rooted in wider human nature? Does this same dialectic you think exists in other cultures, other civilizations?
I think it has a special centrality in Judeo-Christian moral and theological traditions. But since the cultures of our time are not impervious to mutual influences. I think we find something like this tension and the resolution of this tension in the favor of merit and against humility. I think we can glimpse this in other societies as well, especially when merit is tethered, as it tends to be in recent decades, to a market faith. When we believe, as we tend to believe, it's hard not to believe in our societies, that the money people make is the measure of their merit. When we believe that, almost as a kind of unreflected background to the way we think and argue about the economy, it's hard not to valorize the meritocratic side of that long-standing tension, Nick.
Well, that's a fascinating phrase. It's hard not to believe, or it's hard not to valorize. One of the other things I took very clearly from your moral archaeology is how very difficult, maybe even impossible it is to maintain a theology of grace or a philosophy of grace. Repeatedly in this story, there are attempts to do so, attempts to understand the world as gift, as gratuity, and to live like that. But repeatedly, we slide back towards a religious or a secular meritocracy. Is it even possible to sustain that philosophy of gift and grace?
Depends what one means by sustain. The balance and the tension between these two impulses are, I think, and this touches on the first question you asked, Nick, I think they are deeply inscribed in at least modern understandings of freedom. And there is a tendency to understand freedom as self-mastery and self-making and self-sufficiency. And yet, we see time and time again that this is not a satisfying way of living a good life, nor is it an adequate basis for holding societies together. This image of unbridled freedom and self-mastery. So while we are drawn to that image of human agency, it exerts a powerful allure. We realize that we can't fully live by it, either in our individual lives or as societies. And then we struggle to find alternative moral resources. And those moral resources, I think, are what we need now and what in some ways we are searching for in a way that's inchoate and inarticulate. One of the aims of my book is to try not so much to give solutions to, in policy terms, to our present predicament, but to try to provide a language and a moral framework for the, to make our groping toward a common project a little bit less inchoate and a little bit less inarticulate. And that means bringing to bear notions, well, to be very concrete, inviting the successful to acknowledge the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to invite them, to prompt us, to recognize our indebtedness to family, neighborhood, teachers, community, country for our success. And this means deploying this moral vocabulary as a public vocabulary that draws on the second part of this dialectic, whether luck, fortune, grace, mystery, and maybe above all, humility. Because what we've lost as a civic virtue is an orientation to humility. And part of the emphasis on luck, grace, and contingency can prompt the successful to a certain humility that is otherwise missing from our self-understandings and from our civic life.
Well, let's trace a path from that moral archaeology to our contemporary civic life. But let's do so by way of an anniversary. It's 400 years, I think, isn't it? 400 years since the journey of the Mayflower. Yeah. Here's a provocative question for you. Is this a particularly American problem? Is there something in that Puritan DNA, if you like, forming the consciousness and culture of America that naturally leans it towards meritocracy?
There is a special resonance and hold of this way of thinking that runs right through the American experience. That's certainly true. And in fact, the meritocratic ideal of rising, whatever one's origins, however humble, rising as far as one's efforts and talents will take one, this seems almost to define the American dream. And yet, even to put it that way is to notice how widely shared this aspiration is, and the extent to which it shapes the political rhetoric and the rhetoric of aspiration in societies far beyond America. So it may be that the tyranny of merit, the allure of merit, and also its tyranny are especially pronounced in the American experience. And I do think that the backlash against the dark side of meritocracy goes a long way toward explaining the triumph of Donald Trump. But we've also had a backlash against meritocratic elites with the Brexit vote, I think it's fair to say, and in the political sentiments that fuel authoritarian populists and hyper-nationalists in many countries. So I think it has a special resonance and source in the American experience, but I think it's a far broader way of describing aspiration, and the dark side to which it gives rise are also in evidence in societies around the world.
Yeah, I mean, that makes an awful lot of sense, not least as even if, as you rightly say, there is a particular allure of this meritocratic ideal to American culture, it's not as if American culture and politics has always responded in the same way. Right. And one of the striking facts from your book was the remarkable rise in meritocratic political rhetoric from the age of Reagan and in particular Clinton onwards. Beforehand, a lot of the language around merit is there, but it's kind of background. It's massively foregrounded with Clinton, even more so with Obama, although curiously, you say, not so much with Trump. So I guess the question is that simply a facet of this age of neoliberalism? And is Trump, dare I say it, the direction of travel there?
Well, I hope Trump is not the direction of travel beyond November. But it's interesting in vastly different ways, but with a certain overlap. In 2016, Trump and Bernie Sanders on the left were making political arguments that did not draw primarily on what I've called in the book the rhetoric of rising. The whole point of politics is to encourage people to get a university degree so that they can compete and win in the global economy, individual upward mobility as the solution to inequality. This was the mainstream meritocratic frame of politics in the US among Democrats, center left and center right, Democrats and Republicans. And certainly Hillary Clinton embodied this, and this was her message. This was the theme of her campaign. Both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump used a different language. Trump talked bluntly, sometimes crudely, about winners and losers, not about upward mobility, really. And Bernie Sanders spoke about confronting inequalities of income, power, and wealth directly, not equipping those who could clamber up the ladder of success to do so. So both of these, from the right and from the left, were alternative rhetorics. And it remains to be seen, going back to your question, sentiments with which they are often entangled by Trump and other right-wing populists in Europe, whether it will be whether the center-left will find a way to speak to these grievances, to understand these resentments, and to find a language, I would say a language of the common good, rather than relying wholly on the language of individual upward mobility by getting a university degree.
One of the great appeals that meritocracy puts forward is that of social mobility. So one of the arguments, if you argue against meritocracy from the point of view of equality, and it's a perfectly fair argument, many meritocrats will come back at you and say, well, to be honest with you, meritocracy isn't supposed to foster equality, it's supposed to foster social mobility. Right. And yet you show in the book that in actual fact, America has one of the lowest levels of social mobility in the Western, and not just the Western world, even China is showing greater signs of social mobility than America. Right. And yet somehow that doesn't seem to filter through to a wider public consciousness that it isn't generating social mobility. Why do you think that we're not making that connection?
Well, it's true, just as you say, Nick, that when social scientists measure the chance of rising from having been born into a poor family, bottom 20%, and in one generation rising to the top 20% or even above the middle, the chances for social mobility across generations are actually less in the US. Britain is actually quite close to the US than in many Northern European countries, than in Canada, for example. And yet, the belief, the faith in individual upward mobility is more widespread among Americans than among Europeans. In fact, when asked to estimate the chances of rising, Americans overestimated, and Europeans underestimated in their own societies. So I think the reason for this is that our perceptions of facts, the way things are, of empirical reality, is deeply shaped and directed by our convictions, by our ideals. And yet we now experience a lack of alignment between the faith by which we live and the way we explain ourselves, and perhaps also our willingness to abide the deep inequalities of our time, and the facts on the ground. And at a certain point, the gap between the way things are and the way we imagine them to be becomes troubling, discomforting, even galling. And I think we are beginning to approach that point.
I want to ask one more question before I hand over to Elizabeth. I said we would end our brief discussion with a short talk about possible solutions. And you highlight a couple significant ones towards the end of the book. And I wanted you to unpack one in particular, because as you know from previous conversations, it's one that I think is particularly innovative, and I would love to see it instituted. In this country, postcode lottery, I'm not too sure about the US, but postcode lottery is often used as a term of abuse. It's supposed to be that which is quintessentially unfair. And yet you're advocating a bit of a lottery, at least, if not a postcode lottery, for potential admissions to, well, even to Harvard. Tell us what you're advocating and why.
First, I'll say what I've proposed, and this will get me in lots of trouble, I'm sure. Places, and here I'll speak about the US, which I know best. Places like Harvard and Stanford get far more applicants, including well-qualified applicants, than they could possibly admit. Over 40,000 applicants each for about 2,000 places. My proposal is, instead of trying in some very fine-grained predictive way to figure out who among those 40,000 are the absolute best, most promising students from the various points of view that matter, cull out those who are not well qualified to do the work, to do it well, and to contribute to the education of their classmates, to engage fully and interestingly in classroom discussion. Cull those out, and you'd still be left with, I don't know, maybe 30,000 or 25,000 or 20,000. Among those, do a lottery to determine whom to admit. A lottery of the qualified, I call it. And the main reason for doing this is not to make the admissions policy more fair. It's to send a message, to teach something, to send a moral lesson, even before the students arrive, about the balance between achievement, one's own doing, and good fortune, luck. Because this proposal highlights what is, in any case, true, that the 2,000 who wind up getting letters of admission have not done it only thanks to their own doing. It's not that they morally deserve, like the Puritan elect, that they morally deserve to have been chosen or elected. It's that through some complex concatenation of native-born gifts, hard work, opportunities, having chosen the right parents to be born to, through some concatenation of circumstance, they've prevailed. And this will be true with or without my lottery proposal, but it's a way of reminding students and their parents, at least equally important, of the element of luck in this whole process. And maybe it can reduce to some small degree the now very damaging pressures and anxieties for achievement and perfection that have come to take over the lives of the teenage years of those in the relatively well-off classes who will move heaven and earth to get their children in. So that's my proposal, Nick.
Great proposal. Michael, thank you very much indeed for chatting with me. I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth now.
Michael, thank you. I'm sure I am expressing many of the feelings in the room about how rich and challenging and powerful that was. So enormous thanks to you. I also want to say thank you to Annabelle Huxley and her team for all her support through this, to CCLA for their generous partnership. If you enjoyed tonight, if you think the work of Theos is valuable, please consider signing up as a friend or an associate, giving a monthly donation and receiving all of our reports. And do look out for Nick's forthcoming podcast with the first episode launching with Michael Sandel. It's called Reading Our Times. Just keep an ear out, it's in the ether and it will emerge. You can look on the Theos website or follow our social channels. That is the end of the formal part of the evening. Thank you very much and good night.